I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd get into a war with their neighbor. I mean, I'm the wave at the mailman bake cookies for new families type. But the thing about living in an HOA is, you don't get to choose your enemies. Sometimes, they choose you. It all started 2 years after I bought my house. I'd sunk my life savings into this little 2-story place with the red shutters and a big oak tree out front. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I spent my weekends mowing my lawn, painting the trim, planting flowers, making it look like the picture-perfect home the HOA wanted. And then, she moved in. Her real name was Janice, but everyone called her Karen, not behind her back, but to her face. She wore it like a badge of honor. The kind of woman who would measure your grass with a ruler and call the cops because you left your trash bins out 10 minutes late. The first time she came to my door, she didn't even say hello. Just shoved a printed HOA violation notice in my hand and said, "You'll need to repaint your fence. That shade of white is not HOA approved." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Over the next 6 months, I racked up more violation notices than I'd ever seen in my life. One for a crack in my driveway, one for a non-regulation bird feeder, even one for having my curtains drawn in the wrong color. I started calling it the Karen tax, but it didn't stop there. Karen also happened to be the HOA president, which meant she didn't just complain, she enforced. And the more I complied, the more she pushed. It was like she was looking for reasons to break me. Then, the night everything changed. It was a Tuesday in late September. Cool breeze, crickets outside, me sipping tea and reading on the couch. I smelled smoke first, faint, almost like a barbecue, but it got stronger, fast. By the time I stepped outside, the front of my house was glowing orange. Flames were licking up the siding, eating through the shutters. I remember hearing the wood pop as the fire tore through it. Neighbors poured out of their houses, some shouting, some filming on their phones. Someone screamed to call 911. I stood there barefoot, watching my entire life, every memory, every photo, every little thing I'd worked for, turn to ash. The fire department showed up, but it was too late. When the last flame died, all that was left was a blackened shell and the acrid smell of burned plastic and wood. The fire marshal said it looked suspicious. That word stuck in my head all night. The next morning, I got my answer. One of my neighbors, a guy named Tom, came by with a look on his face like he'd just seen a ghost. He said, "I don't know if you want to hear this, but my Ring camera caught something last night." He pulled out his phone. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking the figure. Walking up to my front porch at 1:47 a.m., a gas can in one hand, and the face lit up perfectly by the porch light. Karen, the woman who'd been making my life hell, had just burned my house to the ground. And in that moment, as the shock wore off, I knew this was no longer about a petty HOA feud. This was war. The cops came that afternoon. I handed over Tom's Ring camera footage, expecting sirens, handcuffs, maybe a perp walk down our quiet cul-de-sac. But instead, they just took notes. One officer, this young guy with a clipboard, said, "We'll open an investigation, but don't get your hopes up. Arson cases can be tricky without a clear motive or direct evidence." I stared at him. She had a gas can in her hand, on my porch, minutes before the fire. He shrugged like it was just another Tuesday. Could be circumstantial. She could have been carrying something else. Video's grainy. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be fast. And Karen knew it, because 2 days later, she was outside, wearing her usual smug grin, pruning her roses like nothing had happened. When she saw me, she actually waved. Something inside me shifted right then. If the system was going to take its sweet time, I'd have to play the long game. And the long game meant one thing: patience. I rented a tiny apartment on the other side of town. Every morning, I drove back into the neighborhood, partly to check the charred remains of my house, partly to remind Karen I wasn't going anywhere. She hated that. I could see it in her eyes whenever she caught sight of me. Meanwhile, the HOA was in full spin mode. They sent me a letter expressing sympathy for my loss, but reminding me that my property now posed an aesthetic risk to the community and needed to be cleaned or rebuilt promptly. The kicker? The letter was signed by Karen in her role as HOA president. That's when I started digging. I filed a public records request with the county. Turns out, Karen had been HOA president for 8 years straight. No elections, no challenges. She'd also been sued twice by former residents for harassment, both cases settled privately. And the more I looked, the messier it got. Financial records showed thousands in miscellaneous expenses with no receipts. Vague landscaping contracts paid to companies that didn't seem to exist. She wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was running the HOA like her personal piggy bank. I took all of this to my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel. She took one look at the arson footage, the HOA documents, and said, "If we can't nail her for the fire yet, we'll bleed her dry in court another way. But you need to be ready. This is going to get ugly." Ugly didn't even begin to cover it. Within weeks, Karen was whispering to neighbors that I'd burned my own house down for the insurance payout. One evening I drove by and saw a big hand-painted sign on her lawn, "No fraudsters in our community." Rachel told me not to take the bait. Let her run her mouth. She's digging her own hole. Meanwhile, the fire marshal's report finally came in. Accelerant found on my front porch. Burn patterns consistent with deliberate ignition. Still pending further investigation, but it was one step closer. And then came the twist I never saw coming. One rainy Tuesday morning, Rachel called me and said, "You might want to sit down for this." I did. She continued, "Your case against the HOA has been scheduled for a hearing next week, and guess who's been subpoenaed to appear in court? As the HOA's representative?" I didn't even have to guess. The image of Karen's smug little smile popped into my head instantly. She was going to have to walk into my courtroom, on my terms, and I was ready to make sure she'd regret every single step. The morning of the hearing I wore my best suit, not for vanity, for strategy. When you're going up against someone like Karen, appearances matter. I wanted the judge, the clerks, and anyone in that courtroom to see me as the calm, wronged homeowner, not the angry neighbor she'd been painting me as. Karen, on the other hand, showed up in a blinding white blazer, oversized pearls, and a smile so fake it could have been printed. She strutted in like she owned the place, pulling a rolling briefcase behind her as if she were some high-powered attorney instead of a suburban dictator. I could feel her eyes on me as she sat at the defendant's table with the HOA's actual lawyer, a wiry man who already looked like he regretted taking her case. The judge came in, a stern woman with sharp glasses, and the room fell silent. The case title was read, "My Name versus Willow Creek Homeowners Association." This wasn't the arson trial. That was still crawling through the criminal investigation system. This was about HOA harassment, misuse of funds, and breach of fiduciary duty. Rachel stood first. She started calm, laying out the basics, the violations, the harassment, the suspicious financial records. Then, one by one, she introduced the evidence. Photos of the violations Karen had issued me for things like curtain color. Copies of HOA letters signed by Karen, threatening fines for infractions that didn't exist. Financial statements showing money disappearing into miscellaneous landscaping, while no new landscaping ever appeared. Karen sat stone-faced, until Rachel brought out the pièce de résistance. "Your Honor," Rachel said, holding up a small stack of printed screenshots, "this is a transcript of public social media posts made by Ms. Janice." Karen shot up from her seat. "Objection!" Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering frantically, but she ignored him. "She's twisting things." The judge looked over her glasses. "Ms. Janice, you will sit down, now." Karen sat, but I could see the red creeping up her neck. Rachel went on. "These posts include direct accusations that my client committed insurance fraud, that he was responsible for burning his own home down, and that he wouldn't last long in Willow Creek. Your Honor, these were made after the fire and during an active investigation. We contend that this is not only harassment, but an attempt to intimidate a witness in an ongoing criminal case." The judge's expression hardened. "Duly noted." From there, it was like watching a slow-motion train wreck for Karen. Every time she tried to jump in with a snide comment, the judge shut her down. Every piece of evidence Rachel presented chipped away at the polished image Karen had been trying to project for years. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Rachel called Karen to the stand. She swore in, adjusted her pearls, and sat with the air of someone who still thought they could talk their way out of anything. Rachel started easy. "How long have you been HOA president?" 8 years. "And during that time, have there been annual elections as required by the HOA bylaws?" Karen smiled tightly. "The community was satisfied with my leadership. No one else ran." Rachel slid a copy of the bylaws across the table. "Please read section 4.3 aloud." Karen hesitated, then read, voice dripping with annoyance. "The association shall hold annual elections in the month of May, open to all members in good standing." Rachel's voice stayed cool. "And in your 8 years, how many times has that happened?" Karen shifted. "Like I said, no one else. Please answer the question." Silence. Then Rachel pulled the final card. "Ms. Janice, do you recognize this image?" Karen squinted at the paper. It was a still frame. Tom's Ring camera shot. The grainy porch light, the gas can silhouette, her face. Karen's lawyer objected instantly. Your Honor, this is unrelated to the case at hand, Rachel cut in. It goes to motive, Your Honor. The defendant's harassment escalated to this point. This image has been submitted to the police as part of a criminal investigation. The judge looked at Karen for a long moment. You will answer the question, Ms. Janice. Do you recognize this image? Karen's hands tightened on the armrests. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The silence was deafening. And in that silence, I realized something. I wasn't just going to win this case. I was going to dismantle everything she'd built, brick by brick. Karen didn't answer the judge's question. She just sat there, jaw locked, staring straight ahead, like if she ignored the world hard enough, it might go away. The judge leaned forward. Ms. Janice, the court requires an answer. Karen finally spoke. Not with a denial, but with a sharp, I'm not required to incriminate myself. The room went still. It wasn't a confession, but everyone in that courtroom heard the unspoken truth in her voice. Rachel didn't press further. She didn't have to. The damage was done. From that point on, Karen's veneer cracked. Her lawyer kept objecting, but it was like trying to put duct tape on a sinking ship. Rachel continued methodically. More screenshots of her defamatory posts. Copies of HOA fines issued on days when I wasn't even home. Bank records showing $14,000 in emergency repairs to HOA property that never happened. By the time Rachel rested our case, Karen looked like she'd aged 10 years in an hour. She clutched her pearls like a lifeline, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape hatch. Then came the HOA's turn. Their lawyer tried to spin the story, that I was a disgruntled homeowner with a vendetta, that the HOA acted within its rights to maintain community standards. It'd have worked, if not for the witnesses. Tom, my neighbor with the Ring camera, took the stand. He testified about Karen's history of targeting me, about the night of the fire, about how she'd even made comments at block parties about teaching certain people a lesson. Next came a retired couple who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. They told the court how Karen had fined them $500 for a non-compliant mailbox, only to replace it with the same model 2 weeks later, billed to the HOA. Piece by piece, the image of a benevolent HOA president crumbled into dust. By the end of the day, the judge's tone had shifted. This court finds substantial evidence of harassment and misuse of HOA funds. The association is hereby ordered to hold a full election within 60 days, supervised by an independent third party. Additionally, Ms. Janice, you are prohibited from issuing fines or acting in any enforcement capacity until further notice. Karen's face turned the color of spoiled milk. She wasn't arrested, not yet, but I could see the fear creeping in, because she knew what was coming next. The civil case had been just the warm-up. The real fire, the criminal investigation, was still burning in the background. And now, with her credibility shattered in open court, there was nowhere for her to hide. As we walked out, Rachel leaned over and whispered, "She'll slip. People like her always do." She was right, because 3 days later, I got a phone call from Tom. His voice was almost giddy. "You're gonna want to see this. Check your email." I opened the attachment. It was fresh Ring footage. Karen, in broad daylight, standing at the edge of my burned property, yelling into her phone, and in her rant, loud and clear, she said the one thing she'd managed to avoid saying under oath. "I told you I'd burn his place down if he didn't leave." My hands actually shook. It wasn't grainy. It wasn't circumstantial. It was her voice, crystal clear, and that was the moment I knew. The final nail for Karen's coffin had just been handed to me. I sent the new Ring footage to Rachel within the hour. She didn't even wait to finish listening before saying, "This is it. This is what we needed." By that evening, she'd forwarded everything to the fire marshal, the district attorney's office, and the lead detective on my case. This time, there was no grainy video excuse, no could be something else loophole. It was Karen, her face, her voice, her exact words, bragging about burning my house down. 2 mornings later, I got the call I'd been waiting for. "She's in custody," the detective said simply. And just like that, the nightmare started to flip into a victory. I drove past the neighborhood that afternoon, purely for my own satisfaction. The sight was better than I'd imagined. 2 squad cars in front of Karen's house, officers walking her down the driveway in handcuffs while she barked protests no one cared to hear. Her pearls were gone, her hair a frizzy mess from the rain, and her trademark smug smile erased. Neighbors stood on lawns, whispering to each other. Some filmed, just like they had the night of the fire, only this time the flames were all hers. The charges were serious: arson, destruction of property, harassment, and obstruction of justice. Her lawyer scrambled to work out a deal, but the DA wasn't playing around. Arson with an occupied dwelling nearby? That carried real prison time. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic compared to the civil case. The prosecution had the video, the audio, the accelerant analysis, and multiple witnesses who testified to Karen's vendetta. Her defense team tried to claim the recording was taken out of context. The jury didn't buy it. It took them less than 4 hours to come back with a guilty verdict on all major counts. Karen was sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 8. When the judge read the sentence, I watched her slump in her chair like someone had finally cut the strings on a puppet. No more HOA president, no more fines, no more late-night threats. Just a cell, 4 walls, and plenty of time to think about how her little empire had burned to the ground, just like my house. But the revenge didn't stop there. With Karen gone, the HOA had to hold that court-ordered election. For the first time in years, the community got to vote in someone who actually cared about the neighborhood instead of controlling it. The new board launched a full audit, uncovering even more of Karen's financial shenanigans. The money she'd stolen was clawed back through liens on her property. And guess who bought her foreclosed house at auction? Me. It took some repairs and a fresh coat of paint, but I moved back into the neighborhood exactly 1 year to the day after the fire. The same oak tree stood in the front yard, a little scorched, but still alive. A reminder that not everything she tried to destroy had succeeded. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the quiet street. I hear laughter from kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting over fences. Peace, real peace, finally returned. And every once in a while, when I think about how far she went to try to break me, I can't help but smile. Because in the end, Karen didn't just burn my house down. She burned her own life down, and I made sure I was there to watch the ashes settle.